Welcome back. On Tuesday, it was reported that rock star Ian Watkins pleaded guilty to a string of child sex offences, including 2 counts of attempting to rape a baby.
So what drives someone to commit such horrific acts upon a child?
Well, here to look inside the mind of paedophile criminologist Mark Williams-Thomas and forensic psychologist Kerry Nixon. Thank you both for coming in. This is a very, very dark story. We have to start with what he did. He admitted 13 offences in total over the course of 5 years. Included 2 counts of attempted rape, 2 counts of sexual assault by touching, and that the women are women A and women B, women A's baby, confessed to aiding and abetting women B to sexually abuse her own child. He pleaded guilty to possessing and making indecent photographs of children, as well as having extreme pornographic material involving bestiality on his computer hard drive. Cardiff Crown Court was also given details of a 17-minute video in which the singer performed a sex act on a baby. Court heard that the tattooed singer claims he had no memory of the key video evidence, but his distinctive tattoos were vital in identifying him in the footage. DCI Peter Doyle of the South Wales Police said this investigation has uncovered the most shocking and harrowing child abuse evidence I have ever seen. How does it happen?
Well, it's horrendous. I have to say, in relation to that case, it is horrendous. We don't need to know any more detail about it, but I can tell you, having looked at it very carefully for the last 2 months, it is the worst case I have ever come across.
Really?
And I've worked in this field for a very long time. There are similarities between the Fred Rhodes West scenario. The difference between his offending was that we are talking about very, very young children, and there are no doubt other people out there who are victims of his offending behaviour. The problem being is that the facilitators of that are predominantly the children's mothers, and of course they're not going to come forward because they are going to be in trouble themselves.
So was he born like this? What happens?
There's many reasons why somebody will do this. Different paedophiles, different sex offenders offend for different reasons. Abuse like this doesn't just come out of nowhere. There wouldn't have been that just by taking drugs that the abuse would have started. There would have been things in this man's past that I would suggest that were there prior to his offending behaviour.
So is it human nature at the most deprived and depraved end? Because you are born and you are straight, or you are gay, or you like blonde hair, or you like dark hair? Is it just a case of being born that is your sexual proclivity?
Some researchers would argue that, and you know, paedophilia is in the DSM, and the ICD, which is the tools that we use to diagnose offenders. So it is in there under sexual disorders. However, there's disagreement whether people are born like that or whether they become like that. I would argue that there's a combination of factors often, where somebody may be born with a predisposition to offend. However, then life events, triggers, things that can happen, will then trigger that behaviour happening. I don't believe that all sex offenders are born, all paedophiles are born. However, there's also lots of people who've gone through abuse who don't offend. But the research does show that paedophiles statistically have more child abuse in their backgrounds than non-offenders.
I think we have to be very clear, is this is chosen behaviour.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yes,
so
just before you go any further, I would also point out we know very little about. I certainly know very little about his background, and we would not hint in any way that
I'm talking general.
General.
Yeah.
What were you going to say then?
I mean, this is chosen behaviour. An individual chooses to offend in a way. There are environmental aspects which, of course, would increase that. What we know about offending behaviour is they both have to have access to children and the opportunity to offend. Both of those need to be present for the crime to take place. And in relation to child sex offenders, which I spend an awful lot of time with and spend not. Again, I will never let a sex offender get away with a position where they say, do you know what it happened to me? You know, and I went on offend. Because I tell you what, if it happened to you, why on earth are you therefore going and committing that offence? Because you know what impact it has on you. And in fact, the majority of those people... What do they say to that
when you say that to them?
Well, to be fair, the majority of the people that I have interviewed have not been abused as children. In fact, by and large, they haven't. I can tell you all the people I've been back through, and only one person ever talked about being offended against. And that wasn't by an adult when they were a child. They were a teenager, and it was an older woman. that offended against
Really?
them. So to make that correlation, I don't believe is there. This is chosen behaviour in the very similar way that when you're an alcoholic, you are always an alcoholic. When you're a paedophile, you are always a paedophile. Now, there are changes and differences to that, and someone who works in the treatment process will perhaps differ to what I believe. There are opportunities to provide treatment for sex offenders. There are different categories of sex offenders. Some, there is no point treating them. Put them in prison for the rest of their life and leave them there. They present a risk and a dangerous risk to the community. There are others to which treatment can work. The problem is that that individual must be suitable and want to be treated. And then there's those that it works very well with, because actually the point of treatment is about identifying where those triggers come from, and those triggers being the opportunities that they put themselves in to offend. So in other words, don't go out in the middle of the afternoon when the schools kick out. Don't put yourself in a position where you're going to be around young children.
Following on from that, I mean, I've worked with sex offenders on treatment programmes, and I've also worked with sex offenders out in the community. And I remember one gentleman who offended once, and he was so disgusted that he'd offended once because he had been horrifically abused, systematically abused all his life. So he actually controlled his behaviour. He'd been abused with something to do with water, and so if he ever felt like he was having an urge to offend, he would think of water, and that would stop him offending. He wouldn't go to the shops without his social worker. So there are offenders who know it's...
This was the demon inside. Do it,
yes.
and him being strong enough to try and shut it out.
Exactly what Mark just said. He remembered being a victim.
Yeah.
So he didn't want to victimise other people. So he had strategies in place in order to do that, but some don't have those strategies in place. And as Mark said, there's lots of reasons, and being abused is no justification, because there's many people who are abused who don't go on to offend.
What about those that actually go on to act upon those urges? So I mean, if that's in your mind, whether it's something you're born with, whether it's a preference that you have, whatever it is, when does it cross over to being something that you act upon?
It's that point to which it moves from fantasy to being reality. Now, if you have a fantasy, and people have all kinds of fantasies, if your fantasy is to have sex with a young child, that fantasy, of course, may develop itself, and you start to rationalise it itself in your own mind, in the same way, and we refer to it as being cognitive distortion, in the same way as you might say, I only drive 40 miles an hour in a 30-mile-an-hour zone, all right? They will rationalise it in themselves and say, do you know, it's only a 13-year-old girl, it's not that bad. But then they have to get over all the other hurdles that are in their way. If I get arrested, what's going to happen to my family? If I go to jail, what will happen to me? How will I be seen as a community? But am I going to get caught? And that's the big thing that has to sit with them. And what's the likelihood of me being caught? Because the reality is, and I've spent time with sex offenders, I was recently in H&P Grendon, which is a rehabilitation sex offenders. And interestingly, out of the 35 people sat around there, which included 3 people who had killed children, they all said to me, I knew I'd get caught one day. And that's really, really important that they realise that. But they also talk about it in terms of being...
children, though, does it?
No, absolutely. But that was in a collective point across the board. They also talk in terms of it being a bit like a drug. A bit like, you know, the first time you take that drug, you get to that level. But then every time it happens, you have to get back up to that level, and you develop... And
but is it
it gets worse as well, yeah.
Does the... And I know that this is very generic, and the internet gets, you know, sort of constant hammering. But is this a catalyst, so that if you have an interest, then it allows you to find and feed that interest, and that interest then grows, and you look for something else, and that grows, and you look for something else?
Research has shown there's 3 different types of offenders who will use online pornography and will offend. And the first group is those who will abuse children prior to looking online.
Yeah.
The second group is those who will watch pornography in order to arouse themselves prior to going out and offending.
Yeah.
And then the third group is those that were using the pornography as part of their fantasy, but then that actually increases their urge, similar to what Mark just said. So there is a correlation between online child pornography and contact offending, and there's some recent research that's come out from CEOP that shows this. However, there's no causation, so you can't say that A causes B. There's a relationship. But very much what I believe is that different types of offenders will utilise it in different ways.
And it's all going to be new information because our relationship with the internet is still very, very
Of
new.
course. What it will do is it will lower somebody's inhibitions.
Yeah.
So in the same way that drugs and alcohol can lower your inhibitions, if you're watching extreme behaviours, it will lower your inhibitions. It will also increase your urges and increase your fantasies.
But I do think, let's be positive, okay? The positive, there's a lot of, hey, this is horrendous. You know, this week has been horrendous. We've had some horrible detail with regards to Watkins. What is positive is that we're talking about it.
Yes.
By talking about it, encourages people to come forward and disclose. We know off the back of Savile the amazing amount of people that came forward that are now giving them a voice they've never had before, enabling them to talk up and catch those offenders out there. So there will be people. And it tells the public, do you know what? Just be careful about those people around you, because it's not the stranger, it's not the devil that gets close to your children, it's not the guy that wears the dirty old Mac that sits across the street, it's the person that you know, it's the person that gets close to you, the family friend. And if that serves as one purpose, to save one child, because one member of the family says, you know what, I'm not going to let my child spend time with that person, it serves a purpose.
But the other layer on top of that is that for those babies, it wasn't just him with his power and his manipulation and his celebrity, it was their mothers.
Well, I think,
Absolutely.
and take it away slightly in terms of, you know, talking away from Watkins, is that we do now, though, that offenders are offending against younger and younger children. And of course, the reason they do that is they know that that person won't be able to give evidence against them. So they have reduced, and it's, you know, the horrific nature is that we're now seeing, police officers now regularly seeing images of children who are days old.
But the thing is that the thing, I know this is upsetting you. I know this is upsetting you.
To listen to.
I know you do. But when it is someone who's preying on someone who may be out at school, that is the opportunity of getting them away from their parents. The problem that was arisen out of this is that it had to have the consent.
Well, it's the grooming process,
yes.
it's the targeting process. He
of
targeted
the
women.
vulnerable mothers.
He targeted single women. He specifically targeted single women. There are other offenders do exactly the same through Lonely Heart columns, etc. They will find the lonely women. They will get into those people. Don't forget, he also had fame and popularity on his side, and some of these women were impressed by that. He would then target them in order to gain access to the children. And once he's got the access to the female, he's got access to the child.
But on a positive note, as you say, on a positive note, the one thing we have out of this is that, as painful as it is.
And I do agree with, and this is why it's important to talk about it, I totally get that, but it's a hard subject.
It's a very hard subject, particularly when you're talking about very young children, and I think the grooming process is really important. They don't just groom the child, they groom everybody around the child, and that's something really important. In this case, as you said before, going back to your point, that it was the parents that were involved in this, and that shows the level of manipulation that these offenders have over people in their lives, that they can do that, and they will target. A lot of these women were in their early 20s, they were vulnerable. Not to say that anyway justifies what they did. A mother's role is there to protect a child.
But how do you, and I know we're going wildly over here, but just on a concluding note, how do you prevent that from happening? What do you say to the mothers? What do you say to someone who may be approached in some way?
What we say to parents, what we say to anybody, is anybody that has access to your child, you need to understand why they're having access to the child. And think about two things all the time. An offender can only offend if they have access to your child and the opportunity to offend. So in access, meaning they can be with the child, the opportunity, which is they can't offend unless you are there, if you're there.
Yeah.
So stay with your children, don't give them the isolation.
But if you are with your children, or if you are, or if you have done this, or you are tempted to do this, then as we found out, one day you'll be found out. Someone will catch you.
Yes.
And we're right to be upset. We're absolutely right to be upset, because we should be. This is shocking detail. But I tell you what, the amount of times I come in and we talk, and I tell you, I'm driven, and there will be other people out there that this Watkins case has driven to say, do you know what? We're professionals in this field and we can make a difference. And I would urge anybody out there, if you have the slightest concern, pick up the phone, tell a professional, because there are people out there who are determined to catch these people.
Final word.
And also to help victims, because vulnerable people who are being targeted have often been victimised themselves, and we need to work on the prevention work as well. And as Mark said, access. The one big factor between people who contact offend and who offend only online is the access to children.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much
Thank you
indeed.
very much.
For further help, advice, support or information on anything we've just discussed, have a look at our website. You're back again tomorrow and we'll be back after the break.